Now, it's been a huge embarrassment for Germany. Russia has leaked the recording of a call between high-ranking German Air Force officials in which they can be heard discussing the implications of possible Taurus missiles to Ukraine. So far, these deliveries have not happened, and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz remains firmly opposed to the idea. But this whole story does raise serious questions about the security of the army communications in Germany, especially after it emerged that the call was held on WebEx. Now, to discuss all of this in detail, I'm joined by Dmitri Alperovitch, a leading expert in geopolitics and cybersecurity, with a special focus on Russia and China. Mr. Alperovitch, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Now, I wonder, were you surprised when you first heard about the leaked recording?
Well, I was. I mean, generally, even though the conversation itself, the content itself was not classified, it was fairly sensitive. So it's not something that you want to discuss on an open channel, on an unsecure phone line, which is seems to be the way that this was actually intercepted. It appears one of the participants dialed in from his phone in Singapore. And of course, it's trivial for a power like Russia to intercept phone calls of that nature.
Now, Russia has used this recording to say that Germany is planning an attack on Russian targets. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius called it part of Russia's playbook, essentially. Would you agree with that assessment?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the amazing thing about this recording that the Russians seem to have published unedited is that it actually proves the completely opposite point. The conversation between these German generals talks about the difficulties of supplying towards Ukraine, both the operational difficulties as well as the challenges that Germany faces of not crossing its own red lines and getting too involved in this war. So it actually proves the opposite point from Russia, that not only is Germany not planning to attack any Russian territory or any occupied territory in Ukraine, but it actually has huge concerns about giving Ukraine capabilities to do so.
But I mean, that's the whole point, isn't it? Because when you listen to the recording, it's exactly what you just said. You know, they're talking through the implications and they are effectively laying out how difficult it would be. And at the same time, Russia has used it for its own narrative in terms of Germany is planning an attack. So what kind of goal was Russia pursuing when it leaked this recording?
I think first and foremost, it wanted to embarrass the German military, the German political establishment, by showing that even conversations among its senior military leaders can be intercepted and leaked out publicly. Secondly, I think it did want to twist the narrative and try to further pressure Germany and convince whatever allies Russia has around the world or friends that Germany and NATO and the West more broadly are getting more and more involved in this conflict, even though that is obviously not true.
Do you reckon we'll see more of these leaks in the future?
Well, I would hope that NATO militaries and political leadership will learn from this and will realize that sensitive conversations, politically sensitive conversations, should not be had over open lines. So hopefully there will be measures taken to make this more difficult to intercept these phone calls in the future. But certainly Russia will continue doing this if it's presented with an opportunity to do so.
Now, we've mentioned now that you know, this conversation happened on WebEx, and at the same time there's kind of this suggestion in Germany that, well, this kind of eavesdropping, these kind of recordings, these leaked recordings, this is something that could have happened to any country, any NATO ally. Would you agree with that assessment?
I do. I think the WebEx piece is a little bit of a red herring, because it appears certainly at this point that the conversation was not intercepted through the WebEx system, but from a phone call from a phone that was used to dial into the WebEx conference call. So obviously, phone calls can be intercepted. We've known that for decades by powers that have significant signals intelligence capabilities like Russia. So I don't think that this particular interception had a lot to do with the WebEx itself.
And still, I wonder, you know, why Germany? Is it seen as a weak link in the West? Do you reckon, was that why Russia targeted Germany here?
Well, I think it was a targeted opportunity. I'm sure they're trying to conduct espionage against all the NATO allies. And in this particular case, you had a senior general that was attending an air show in Singapore. Looks like he was dialing in from his hotel room. Not clear if it was dialing in from his phone or from potentially even a hotel phone. And that certainly presented a targeted opportunity for the Russians.
Now, I think in Germany, a lot of people are quite worried about an escalation of the war and about, potentially Germany getting involved in this war in some form or another. What role does this leak and the response in Russia also, mean in terms of fostering fear-mongering?
Well, there's fear-mongering and there's reality. In fact, if anyone listens to the phone call or the transcript that's been published, you would come away with actually a great deal of appreciation for the concerns that Germany has, which are much greater than the concerns that apparently the British or the French have, who have provided long-range cruise missiles to Ukraine, in terms of both getting too involved in the targeting of those cruise missiles that it appears that the Germans and, the British and the French are doing, concerns around how they would be actually transported to Ukraine and how to avoid the German military from being involved in that. So there's a lot of thought that's being put in by the German military, by the German political establishment in terms of providing aid to Ukraine, but not get operationally involved in this war. So if you're actually looking at the details of this phone call, you would come away with a greater sense of relief that if you're concerned about escalation, that Germany is thinking through those possibilities very carefully.
Now, German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius has referred to this as part of an information war. How much, what kind of precedent is there almost, historically seen maybe for this kind of, wiretapping and releasing these recordings?
Well, we have seen this before from likely Russian actors for many years. In fact, your viewers may recall a circumstance back in 2014 during the Ukrainian Maidan movement, where Victoria Nuland, then a senior official in the State Department, whose phone call was intercepted and leaked by the Russians to try to embarrass her and the unflattering things she was saying about Europe to try to divide the Western alliance. So this is the typical Russian playbook. Again, if you're not careful, if you're using open phone lines, you're basically just playing into their hands because you're just asking for your phone calls to be intercepted this way.
Now, what can Germany do better to protect itself from Russian eavesdropping in the future? Except for maybe not using the phone.
That's right. I mean, you have to go back to the basics and look at how operational security should be done for sensitive conversations. Certainly at a classified level, you should always be having those conversations in secure facilities, never out in the open, certainly never over the phone. But even for unclassified but sensitive conversations, you want to think through encrypted communication channels to make sure that there's end-to-end encryption on both ends when you're having those conversations. Put extra caution when you're overseas and attempting to have those conversations. So this is something that intelligence agencies and militaries have known about for decades. It's just a matter of putting it into practice and making sure that particularly senior officials do not take the easy route and use a communication channel that's convenient but not secure.
Now, I wonder whether there are ways in which Germany could or should retaliate in the sense of also releasing recorded conversations that were possibly intercepted on the Russian side. What do you think of that?
Well, again, I think Germany comes off actually, based on the content of the conversation here, in a very good light. So to the extent that anyone is going to listen to it or read the transcript, I think they'll come away quite happy if your concern is escalation about the process that Germany is going through to determine if it should supply these Taurus missiles to Ukraine. Now, at the same time, you have to ask the question of what purpose would it serve to leak some conversations that are potentially intercepted from Russian actors. If it's a way to try to undermine the Putin regime, if it's tried to embarrass them, then that might be worth doing based on its own merits, regardless of what has happened in this particular case. But otherwise, getting involved in the tit-for-tat and potentially losing interception capabilities, because the Russians would, of course, react and shut down any insecure channels that they're likely using. If you were to do this, that's probably not helpful.
Why hasn't, the Five Eyes, for example, the alliance of intelligence services from Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the UK and the US, why haven't they released any intercepted conversations from the Russian side since the start of the conflict in Ukraine?
Well, usually most intelligence agencies don't do this because they value a great deal the ability to keep intercepting and learning from your enemy's conversations, and that has tremendous benefits, of course, over the long run. The minute you leak something, you might lose that capability. Very likely you will. So most intelligence agencies are very hesitant to do so.
When you think about this whole story now, I finally just want to ask, what you think are the key takeaways from this in terms of learning experience, but also in terms of, what people should know about Russian tactics in this since the start of the war in Ukraine?
I've been bothered for a number of years now about the propensity of senior leaders, both in Europe and frankly, even in the US, to use unsecure communications, use their cell phones for sensitive conversations. I remember the famous documentary of Emmanuel Macron when he was doing shuttle diplomacy between Moscow and Ukraine right before the war, famously filmed using his cell phones for having these conversations, including when he was in Russia, conversations that, of course, would be trivial for the Russians to intercept. So senior leaders in every country should learn that this is not an acceptable secure communication method. You will be intercepted. Chances are, if you're saying something that could be portrayed as embarrassing, those conversations could be leaked by your adversaries, and that really needs to stop.
Maybe actually one more question. I mean, you said that the content of the phone call isn't so problematic, but I mean, that it was intercepted and then that it was leaked is obviously quite an embarrassing thing for Germany. What does that not undermine Germany's image in NATO as well? Can it, in terms of can it still be trusted?
Well, I think every country, unfortunately, is practicing similar lax communication, operational security. So I think anyone in NATO that would throw stones in Germany for getting intercepted this way needs to realize they're likely living in a glass house as well.
Okay. Mr. Alperovitch, thank you so much for your time and for your expertise.
Thank you.